we're almost up to the figure that we were expecting, but we'll make a start and others can join us. So first of all, a very good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our regular Friday webinar at midday. My name is Andrew Carpenter. I am Chief Executive of the Structural Timber Association and also CE in the Southwest and the Midlands. And I'm joined as host today by the rest of the CE family, nationally and the regions, and also by CIOB Southwest. So these Friday webinars are now brought to you by a group of organisations, and we thank them all for their help in promoting it. As I said just now, I'm delighted today that we have got Mark Farmer with us as our guest speaker. I can think of no one better to come out of the Easter break than to ask Mark to join us and just give us a bit of an update on Modernise or Die, because obviously MMC 5 years ago, when this report first came out, was not as widespread in terms of acceptance. So I do think that Mark's had a huge impact on the acceptance of MMC as a building solution right across the supply chain, clients, contractors, consultants, and of course suppliers. And certainly those of us within the Structural Timber Association are particularly pleased with what Mark's done, because we've seen a significant increase in the interest and use of timber frame. But more about that later. What I'm going to do now, ladies and gents, is hand over to my colleague Howard from Leaders Meets, and he'll take you through the house rules and the survey. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to everyone. If you'd like to use the chat pane, you can let people know who you are, and that helps other people who are along here knowing who's in the room, and of course, maybe you know people. So that's please feel free to use the chat pane. We're going to be using Slido today that Andrew's already introduced to you. We'll be using Slido in 3 ways. We're going to be running in a moment a short poll that I'll take you through, which are questions that Mark has kindly given to us. We'll also be using Q&A for all questions today. So if you have any questions, please do put your questions forward in the Slido poll. It will actually have Q&A if you look on your screens. And what you could do is, if you think there's a good question or a question similar to yourself, you can vote for that question, and that will accelerate it up the list of questions. We'll also be using Slido at the end for getting feedback on your views and how you thought today went and any improvements, etc., which we greatly welcome. So at the end, we will also keep the poll open for about a quarter of an hour after today's session is finished, so it gives you plenty of time to actually complete it. So what I think we'll do now is we'll go straight into today's poll, and we can put it up on the screen. Already 23 of you have actually completed it, which is thanks very much. But we've got nearly 100 in now, so it'd be nice if we could get 60 to 70%. So don't have to rush with this, but I'll take you through the questions. So let's have the first question up then, please, Abraham. Do you think the construction industry is finally building momentum towards modernisation? This is your view. Fascinating to see what the room thinks. So your opinion be greatly appreciated. The next question: do you think the government policy environment around home building, construction, and infrastructure is accelerating this momentum towards modernisation? 31 people have now completed that question. So we'll move on to the next one. Do you think the decarbonisation and sustainability agenda can be another accelerant of change? So 42, that's great. Keep it coming. Next question, please, Abraham. Is your business moving towards greater use of MMC? So that's I think everyone knows what MMC means, modern methods of construction, for those who are not. So just an explanation of the acronym. So the next question then, please. Do you think pre-manufactured value is a useful proxy measure to chart incremental progress in industry improvement? If you don't understand pre-manufactured value, that will create an interesting question. But I gather that it's now quite a PMV is quite a common acronym used. And the last question then, please.
Oh, that's the last one.
That is the last question. Fine. There we go. Thanks very much. So let's see, we've got 48 people, 52 have answered polls. So please keep answering as we go along. I'm now going to hand back to Andrew, and we'll give you the results of this after Mark's presentation.
Thanks, Howard, very much. We've had a note in the chat box to say that someone's struggling to answer questions. To answer the poll. So if you could have a look at that, Abraham, that would be much appreciated. Just before I introduce Mark, I'm going to take a leaf out of a webinar host's book from the United States. Both Mark and I have attended events in the States, and you can do that online. And you'll know, Mark, who I'm referring to when I just do a few shout outs, because he taught me that this is always a good thing to do. So I'm going to say hi to Janet Flowers, Gordon Seath, Mark Davis, Bill Keir, Darren Warnford, Mark Southgate, John Meller, Robert Chapman, Peter McDermott, Simon Murray, and Linda Thompson, all who've mentioned themselves and their businesses in the chat box. So there's an Americanism for you. I thought that was appropriate, Mark, as we've both been guests in that situation. Anyway, let's get back to the plot. In our introductory slide, it says 2017. I thought it was actually late 2016, Mark, that your report Modernise or Die came out. But there is no doubt that it's had a huge effect on how we construct our projects and buildings going forward. For many, many years, I've been an advocate of MMC solutions. But to be honest with you, up until 5 years ago, it was like pushing water uphill. But now we have a situation, thanks to your report and the work that you've done since, where government, clients, contractors, the supply chain are all accepting MMC as a solution that we need, particularly in housing, as we try and build 300,000 homes a year. And I think we've all learned in the last 12 months in particular how some of the behavioural and cultural changes that were needed are actually easier than we thought, because we've been forced to adopt them. So Mark is obviously the owner of Cars Consultancy, but many of you may not know that he's also a co-chair of Constructing Excellence, and we're delighted to have Mark as our co-chair in that position, being such an influential person. And I'm delighted, Mark, that you've been able to take time out of your very busy diary to join us today. I'm going to hand over the microphone and the slide screen to yourself, and we'll come back at the end with some Q&A. So folks, while we're listening to Mark, if any questions come into your mind, please use Slido, not the chat box, if you would. If you could use Slido, and then we'll go through the questions and answers once Mark's finished. But for now, Mark, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be able to participate in this Leaders Meets event and to support what Andrew and Howard and the team have been doing over the last year or so during lockdown in terms of just promoting a sort of an industry-wide debate on key issues. So I'm going to spend probably half an hour or so just sort of giving you a bit of a stock take, really, in relation to where I think we are in terms of industry modernisation. What does that look like in terms of some of the things I said in 2016? You're right, Andrew, it was 2016, October 2016 that I published my report. Can I just check before I go on that everyone can see my screen? That's probably the first thing I just need to double check.
All good, Mark. All good. Great. At this end.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a whistle-stop tour around what I think's been going on, what some of the big drivers for change are, some of which I predicted, some of which actually have come in left of field, and perhaps adding to the need for us to sort of just rethink how we do things. And just to sort of start at the beginning, I suppose, in terms of what I said back in 2016, it was very clear to me that many of the things I was sort of setting out as being symptoms of failure were not news to anyone. These are things that have been covered many times before in many reports, and I was obviously a bit concerned about just going over old ground, but for the sake of completeness, I think it was important just to sort of set out the basic core issues in relation to what cause and effect is, I suppose, of some of our industry failings. And I talked about these 10 symptoms of failure. One of the areas in particular that I had concerns about was that one there around workforce size and demographics. I sensed that the timing of my report in 2016, that particular issue, the sort of the resourcing base of our industry was becoming more and more of an issue that perhaps was a long-term structural issue that hadn't been so high profile and such a risk area, perhaps in previous times when reports of the industry or reviews have been undertaken. And to be quite frank, what's happened in the intervening 4.5 years is that issue has only been further amplified, and you just have to see the various headlines that have abounded, and all these are all very recent headlines actually. So this gives you an idea of the currency of this debate about the fact that we have a declining skills base, and in a low productivity, labor intensive industry is not a good thing. So if we continue to rely on high levels of labor, particularly on-site labor to install the traditional ways of how we put buildings together, then that is a recipe for problems ahead. And what's happened obviously with Brexit and with COVID-19 in the last 12, 13 months has only added to that sense that we have some big issues ahead in terms of our physical ability to deliver the construction that our economy needs in relation to supporting economic growth, but also delivering key infrastructure and house building. As I say, COVID has been something that's come in completely left of field. I don't think anyone could see this one coming in terms of the effects of a global pandemic. It clearly had an initial big impact on construction, and we had to get used as an industry to working in a very different way in relation to social distancing on construction sites. We got organised as an industry through leadership from the CLC around what that looked like as a protocol for safe working. But what that did was it actually just further amplified the fact that as soon as you start taking the ability to load a construction site up with very intensive levels of labour, then you're into problems around how you get output delivered. And what that's forced the industry to do, if anything, and this has actually been an accelerant of change in my opinion, is to get inventive around how do we overcome some of these issues? How do we actually move processes off site perhaps? How do we pre-assemble and pre-manufacture more? How do we get more productive so that actually the fact that we have less labour on sites doesn't necessarily mean a commensurate fall in output from construction sites and delays in projects. And this sense that skills and labour is still at the heart of all of our issues has only really been further reinforced by the fact that we've had, very recently, and these reports here are all reports from the last month or so, if I'm correct, including the CLC's latest industry skills plan. They're all pointing to the fact that we have some ongoing issues, not just with quantum of labour and the fact we have an eroded workforce in relation to ageing and Brexit, repatriation and issues around attracting new skills, but we also have an issue around what skills we physically need for the future, particularly around building differently to enable decarbonisation, which I'll come back to shortly. And all of this is just really making my observation in 2016 around that labour and resourcing issue perhaps even more front and centre, and certainly in my mind. And then if you look at the impacts of Brexit and COVID, because the two have sort of combined and conspired in a sort of a fairly dramatic way in some respects over the last 18 months or so to add to our industry's tensions and problems. This also has an impact on material supply chain. So this is not just a human capital issue, it's not just a labour issue, it's actually about our supply chains. We are heavily reliant on imported materials, and if that remains the case, then actually we have a fragility in our supply chain, and both certainly COVID opened that up a lot, certainly in April, May, June last year when we saw supply chain starting to get fractured, and Brexit is a longer term issue we have to deal with in terms of ensuring that we have frictionless movement of goods and materials at borders. And that's something that, again, we need to be wary of in terms of our supply chain engineering and how we're actually delivering schemes in terms of what materials we're designing and where they come from. And the other thing that has continued at pace is the ongoing issues around making money in construction. And the headlines are numerous, and I'm not going to labour the point, but it still remains a big challenge to make money in construction, and that is in a period when we've had relatively high levels of work. So it's been a buoyant market. give or take, with the last 12 to 15 months and COVID, and contractors and supply chain members still, in many instances, are struggling to make money. And that really is a symptom of the model that's being used, the fact that it's a cash flow based business rather than a margin based business. And to be honest, is really reflective of the fact that we're baking in so much waste into our industry in the process, that actually, if we were to turn our attention to focus on cutting the waste, we could all fund a bit more margin in what we do without having to put the prices up for our end clients. And alongside that, we have the ongoing and probably worsening scenario in some instances around the public facing prevalence of poor quality in home building particularly. And it's not exclusive to home building, but new home building tends to be where the press and the media focus their attention, and some of the headlines and the images that you see, and this is mainstream media, this is not trade press, this is stuff that's splashed all over the mainstream television networks and the national newspapers, has not a good look. And it's a symptom, again, going back to the labour, resourcing and skills-based issues. These are all just byproducts of those same issues. The fact that we're stressing our industry, we're actually diluting the skills base and competency levels, and actually what's happening is we're producing poor quality products. And consumerism is now fighting back against that. So the ability to get away with that is now really declining, and poor quality work is getting called out more and more. And one of the things that I often quote is this, what I call economic cycle amplification, which is a bit of a mouthful, but what it's suggesting is the resiliency of our industry is declining, and we have this because of the resourcing issues around labour, the material supply chain fragility I've mentioned. Every time there's an upturn and downturn, the impact on tender prices tends to be more amplified, because the elasticity in pricing is actually declining. You have much more of a rigid approach and much more of an overreaction to upturns and downturns, where you get higher levels of price inflation, where you get labour, resource issues and material supply chain issues pushing up prices. And actually, as soon as people start to realise that work is falling away, then there's this massive sentiment shift that drives people to want to go and hunt for new orders, and actually they reduce their prices very rapidly. And that's not a good position to be in for long-term thinking, to actually promote a sustainable industry that's about long-term steady margins, as opposed to the ups and downs of a boom and bust industry that's all about resource scarcity and just sort of living for today rather than anything in the longer term. And the way in which clients commission work contributes to that. It's very much project to project rather than program and strategically led. So, this is not just about the industry, this is about clients and how they ask the industry to deliver. From a government perspective, my report in 2016 set off a bit of a chain reaction, I suppose, in terms of other reports, which I don't apologise for. I think it's all been a really useful debate as to what role government can have in influencing how we change, how we do things in construction. It's coincided with other things that have nothing to do with my report, actually, on a wider level around transformational change in society, and the climate change agenda, for instance, is something that's really started to motor in more recent times. And obviously COVID, as I've already said, in many ways I think will act as a bit of an accelerant and a catalyst for change in terms of the roadmap to recovery, as CLC have termed it. What does that look like? How do we have to change what we do to overcome some of these longer term issues? And what's clear to me is that sort of government sense of needing a fit for purpose construction industry has only accelerated and actually increased, and all of the mood music I see and these publications here, which are all relatively recent, and they're all in the last 6 months or so, 6 to 8, 9 months maybe, are all things that have huge implications around how government wants to change the regulatory regime, but also how it wants to act as a client for its own public works programme, whether it's the National Infrastructure Strategy or the Construction Playbook, in how government departments will be procuring work in the future, or the 10-point plan for decarbonisation that the Prime Minister announced. These are all really important steps that have big impact potentially on how construction will be influenced by the government. And then in home building, if I just focus in on the home building sector in particular, which is where I work in my business, I just sense that we're at this time where sort of the quality and the quantity debate is being had in equal measure now. So there's always been perhaps a push towards wanting to increase home building output and get the quantity levels up with less concern about quality, which has led to some issues in the past. But you only have to look at what the range of different politically important initiatives now running across planning, the future home standard and decarbonisation, the building safety agenda, the consumer protection and consumer redress debate. All of these things mean that we have to increase our numbers without diluting quality this time, and that's got to be a good thing, I think, for the industry. And just sort of further build on that home building sector element of policy, what's clear is there's also an acceleration in how government wants to inject modernisation into home building through MMC as being a key central plank of that. And that's starting to show itself now in some very specific policy terms, particularly through how Homes England are administering their investment funds and disposing of public land, and actually being much more muscular in relation to wanting the industry to up its game in many respects in terms of how it uses MMC in a positive way. And then alongside central government, you have, I think, an increasing awareness from regional and local government that MMC can be a real change agent for regional economic growth and local industrial strategies. So lots of examples that are indicated here of places, cities and city regions embracing MMC and seeing it as being a critical part of moving forward an agenda around not just new home building, but reskilling the workforce, attracting inward investment, decarbonising local economies, embracing digital, etc., etc. And that again is adding to the interest in MMC. It's not just a central government play now. This is actually being played out in local, regional contexts as well. And then most recently, just a few weeks ago in the budget, the Chancellor announced that this whole push for MMC in home building would be further supported by the setting up of a new task force, an MMC task force, which was going to be looking at how it could accelerate the uptake of MMC across the UK, including in linking to these regional devolved areas of government, and specifically mentioning the West Midlands and Liverpool City region as two examples of regional mayoral governments that actually are really trying to push on with MMC proposals. And if I just sort of go back to sustainability and decarbonisation, which I've touched on a couple of times, I think it's a really interesting time at the moment. The last 12 months I just sense, and it's sort of some of it parallel to COVID, it's not related directly to COVID, just I think it's just happened to be running a parallel path, that the decarbonisation of our economy and sort of the awareness of what's going on, societal awareness of climate change, Greta Thunberg's impacts in that sort of just having that conversation about climate change, sustainability, COP26 coming up in Glasgow this year. It's all really sort of raised the awareness and actually got a lot of people thinking, what are we going to do? Because the built environment is a massive contributor to emissions. It's 40-odd% in some shape or form in terms of how we build, operate, or demolish built assets. And actually, we've got to do something about that. And we have to start pretty quickly, and we're probably overdue and we're behind the game. And we have to do that from both an operational carbon perspective and an embodied carbon perspective, because the process waste that goes into the industry is pretty horrific as well. It's not just the operational performance of the buildings, it's how we deliver those buildings, it's the materials we're using, the manufacturing that sits behind those materials, the transportation and value chains that goes into it as well is pretty ineffective and inefficient in many ways. So we have to face into that. We have to look at cutting the waste, and I think that is again a proxy for adoption of MMC. But we also have to think about how we square the circle of how do we decarbonise and use different materials. And there is some interesting challenges at the moment that I'm seeing around a move to more sustainable materials, including timber. And the issue of fire safety and how do we do this in a way that takes the industry and public confidence with us? How do we innovate to decarbonise traditional materials? How do we prove that timber is safe in environments that currently there's some concerns on? And we have to work across all of those different fronts and move away from sort of fairly siloed industry lobbying bodies, which are all about protecting interests in particular parts of the supply chain, and just work collectively as an industry, in my view, to open up the world of innovation and material science so that all of these materials actually can be used in ways that actually harm the planet in a less dramatic way. And if I sort of take a step back and then move it on to what's been happening in the industry in the period since Modernise or Die, it's interesting to see that some of that government mood music around setting the scene on wanting a modern construction industry in the UK is starting to get traction, not just in the UK, but actually from overseas players who see the UK as an interesting place to invest in, to deliver things differently. And you look at the headlines here, whether it's Goldman Sachs investing into Top Hat, whether it's the GS Engineering Group from Korea investing into Elements Europe, whether it's Skanska IKEA coming to the UK for a second time with Bekluk. All of these are indicators that we've got interest from overseas in inward investment and IP transfer, because actually they see the UK as a fertile ground for revolution in how we build homes. And this is particularly around home building. I would say that the interest is centered, and that includes some fairly large and world-leading expertise from Japan, which has a very well-rounded and mature manufacturing sector, particularly in home building. So you have the likes of Sekisui House and more recently Daiwa House coming to the UK for that very reason. They see opportunities, they see a positive government policy backdrop, they see a low starting point, an industry that hasn't really embraced change, and actually there's low-hanging fruit to intervene and move the market on. And that move to industrialization, the move to MMC is critical, because actually, there's a commercial angle to this as well, because industrialization is all about scale and volume and unit efficiencies, and being able to reduce unit production costs and cutting out waste, et cetera. And going back to that point I made about why the industry struggled to make money, this is the route to how we're going to all make more money if we can attack the waste. And industrialization doesn't have to be big set piece factories. It can show itself in very different ways, and I'll come on to that in a second. But ultimately, we need to attack the waste if we're going to make more money, because clients can't afford to pay more money for construction. This is not a situation of just upping margins by increasing total selling price. Clients have their own pressures in their own core markets, whether they're developers or corporate real estate, corporate occupiers, or it's the government building its own infrastructure. So we need to get smart about how we fund margining out of cutting waste. And in turn, that needs to avoid the behavioral issues that we always repeat around the race to the bottom, and the fact that if you want to win work, too many businesses are tempted just to buy the work and then worry about it afterwards. Clients seem to be getting a good deal, but they're not. It's a false economy, and we keep self-inflicting harm on ourselves by repeating these failures. And procurement reform is a critical element of this, and thinking differently about how we procure, intelligent clienting, intelligent advice from consultants advising clients as well, are critical to opening up this opportunity in opening up industrialization and waste reduction. And just sort of bringing this to the last part of what I want to talk about today, which is how do we measure progress? So, what's happened since 2016? How much is Modernise or Die having an impact, and other things having an impact? I bring this back to some key building blocks in terms of defining what we mean by MMC and defining where industry is around the level of manufacturing and level of on-site construction is happening. And that's why I talk a lot. I was involved in setting up the MMC definition framework you see on the left-hand side there for MHCLG back in 2019. It was a very inclusive and broad spectrum of different types of MMC that are defined in that definition framework. It's not just about category 1 volumetric modular, it's about panelized systems, it's about non-systemized pre-manufacturing, it's about sub-assemblies, it's about innovative materials, and actually it's about stuff that happens on site that's nothing to do with off-site manufacturing. It's a combination of all of those 7 categories, which I won't go into now, but are available on that web hyperlink you see on the bottom left there, and then linking that to this term pre-manufactured value. So PMV is basically a percentage of what percentage of a job is manufactured, as opposed to its value being derived from site activities, whether that's site labor, whether that's contractor preliminaries and management and temporary works and plant. It's basically a percentage measure that shows you where you are on that sliding scale of having a more manufactured job and a leaner job in terms of less site labor needed for every unit of material and component costs that you're installing. It's a very simple measure. But it's actually very difficult for industry to understand where they are, because it's not something we capture at the moment ordinarily. And there's lots of reasons why the transparency of that measure is not very high. But my view is we need to be moving towards thinking about PMV. We need to be using it in a more industry-wide sense to drive forward change, because PMV is a proxy for all of these things that you see here. And there's 7 criteria that are listed, and there's probably more in reality, that if you increase your PMV, you should have, all other things being equal, a positive outcome on all of those 7 criteria. And that's why this is important as a policy tool. It's why government is starting to use it as a proxy measure for improvement in construction. It's also being used as a procurement tool to influence change. It's being used by clients to influence design briefs. So we can start to see the beginnings of how we incrementally change. It doesn't have to be a binary, it's either a traditional job or it's a category 1 volumetric job. There's a whole host of things in between that actually enable us to improve what we're doing and do it in a sensible way that actually makes sense for the context of your project. And that, in visual terms, a traditional residential construction project, for instance, has a PMV of about 40%. Which means 40% of the job is made up of material costs and components and maybe even modules. And then 60% of the cost of the job is site labor and the preliminaries of managing the job and putting it together on site as a site overhead. I see a world where that moves to something much more like this, where we move from 40% to 55% PMV across a whole range of different techniques. So again, this is not one size fits all. This is this gradual MMC adoption and shifting the dial so that we're less reliant on site-based activities. We're manufacturing more, we're compressing our site labor through site efficiencies and off-site manufacturing. It's a combination of both, because that's how we're going to attack the waste. That's the route to making more money. And that's the route to making more money without putting the price up for clients. There's a short-term challenge around volumes, where MMC is often seen as a premium activity. And I think that is gradually going to change as we reset the baselines for economics in manufacturing. And if you want to play around with PMV and the concept of it, if you want to go onto that web link there at the bottom, there's some stuff that my business has done, of which it's trying to educate. It's all open source. It's trying to educate the wider industry around how you calculate your PMV and what are the contributory factors and how does it link to the MMC definition framework. And in the last month or so, Homes England have adopted the PMV metric as part of their new capital funding guide for the Affordable Homes Programme. You will start to see references, you are seeing references to PMV, you're starting to see references to categories 1 and 2 of the MMC definitions framework, but 55% PMV is, for instance, an indicator of what Homes England want to see from their strategic partners. The PMV of 55% can be achieved a whole series of different ways through a whole series of combinations of different MMC applications. So it's not forcing you to use a particular approach. And just to finish, I'll just sort of put this into real context of what does this look like. So I've shown some images here of some projects my business a bit of been involved with initially. So this is a job in Bristol we've been doing for Legal & General, which is a build to rent scheme. This is a fairly simple application of MMC. This is a brick slip system being applied to the facade, pushes the PMV up to 45%. It's the beginning of that journey from 40% that I mentioned. This is another scheme we're doing in central London, where the contractors used the precast concrete frame, has unitised the facades, pre-manufactured some elements of the M&E. It's got himself up to 50%. This is a scheme where my business is not actually involved in this, but you will probably all know about this. This is the Sterling Prize winning scheme in Norwich, Goldsmith Street, which was a closed panel timber framing system that actually with the rest of the work done traditionally, still achieve 50% PMV. and then into more complex buildings where you've got lots of different methods being used, combination of precasting, unitized facades, bathroom pods, utility cupboards, prefabricated M&E runouts on the soffits there you see on the right, whole hybrid approach to just taking elements of a job and moving it off-site. Not having to do it all at once, but actually doing it in bits and then bringing things to site, and the site becomes a factory in itself. This is another example of building next door. This is 65% PMV. This is a live project still on site at the moment. That's being delivered using a hybrid approach. And then probably the most sort of common external face that you see of MMC, lots of people think this is the only route to MMC. It's certainly the most dramatic, which is a full category 1 volumetric scheme. This is the highest resi modular scheme in Europe at the moment in Croydon, which was delivered through a volumetric solution that then was clad separately. So it was 70% PMV. It would have been higher if it had been clad in the factory, but that was the appropriate way in which that scheme design came together. And then finally, a more domestic scale example of category 1. So this is a top hat scheme in Chatham in Kent, where virtually everything's being done in the factory. It's up 80% PMV, which is about the high as you can go, where even the facades were pre-clad in the factory. And just to be clear, the higher the PMV doesn't mean that actually you have to aspire to the highest PMV you can achieve. There is actually, this is all about incremental change. So there'll be an appropriate PMV for your project based on the context of what works from a design and constraints perspective. So just to close, so a lot going on there, but if I was to summarize for a sort of bit of a stock take, what's been happening since my report, we have been seeing that continued shrinkage of our resourcing and labour base. We've had the tragedy of Grenfell, which I think has brought building safety to the fore, quite rightly, and has shone a fairly dramatic light on some of the inefficiencies and the poor behaviours and practices in our industry. We've actually also, one of the things I didn't cover was the fact that we have had some fairly dramatic bad experience around major infrastructure, particularly Crossrail, in terms of its failure to be delivered on time and on budget, which is symptomatic of many of the things I've been talking about. We've had Brexit happen, we've had COVID-19 happen, we've had that race to zero and the sustainability agenda starting to accelerate. We've had this ongoing issues around scandals on quality in the new build home building market, and we've got a government that seems to be committed to continue to want to push the industry in the right direction, and a range of MMC solutions that's increasing, new entrants turning up, general market awareness seems to be growing, and the actual uptake is increasing. But there are, don't get me wrong, some very real barriers still remaining to us really moving forward with MMC at scale. And a lot of the work I'm doing at the moment is trying to overcome some of those remaining barriers so we can really push on at scale. So thank you for listening. I'm very happy to take questions and also to unpick what's happened on the poll and just in terms of the view of the audience as to some of the questions being raised. So thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. Always inspirational to listen to and always content that is valuable and meaningful. I would ask, ladies and gentlemen, however, if we could just have a moment's silence, because during your presentation, Mark, Buckingham Palace announced that Prince Philip has died. And I think it's probably appropriate if we just have a moment's silence while we think of a man that has given so much service to our country. So if I could just ask you to be silent for a moment. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What I'm going to do now is ask Howard and Abraham if they would perhaps share the results of the survey, Mark, and perhaps you'd like to comment on those. And then we'll go through some of the questions, Abraham, if you could get them ready on the screen. We'll go through them after we've seen the survey. Let's do that first, please, Abraham.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, we've got about an average of 65 people who've responded, which we've got about 120 people listening. So, it's a good representation. So let's have a look. What do people think? So 77% think yes, 23% think no. So, Mark, there's still almost a quarter of the people in this room that think that the industry actually isn't building momentum. Would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, look, I think you know, that is absolutely a fair reflection on where I believe we probably are. I think, you know, everyone will have their own perspective on this from their own context of where their business is, what they see day to day, and it's quite clear our industry is a huge melting pot, and the sort of osmosis of modernization and change, it's not something that happens en masse across the entire industry as a blanket. It happens in pockets. It is very much about where you are in the industry. It's very much about what part of the industry you're in structurally as well as sector wise. So I'm not, you know, this is never going to be a sort of a binary black and white answer. There's always going to be a range of opinions. So but I'm heartened to see that 3/4 of the audience actually do see that things are building ahead of steam, which is good.
Thanks. We do have a question that will come down back. I think the most popular question that probably raises this issue in another way. So next one, please, Abraham. More positive view here, but again, 40% of people have a view, Mark, that's perhaps negative. Do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, so I think again this is very fair. You know, what you've got is a government doing things around policy in terms of how it acts as a client, and also how it sets a broad regulatory framework as to how it might influence the broader industry, including private sector clients, and that will be visible in different ways to different people. Again, and actually, I think it's also fair to say the government can't change construction on its own. Even if the government was to become a leading client and be, you know, pushing MMC and digital technology on all of what it does, which actually it doesn't at the moment. Let's be fair, we were still on the journey of how government reforms how it delivers construction. Even if it was to do that, though, it wouldn't be able to change the industry. I think the issue here is more about, is it actually helping? Is it accelerating? And again, you know, the fact that more people see that positively than not is a positive. But I'm completely understand that spread of opinion as to what people were seeing and sensing at the moment.
Okay, thanks very much. Next one, Abraham. We haven't got many people disagreeing on this one, Mark.
Yeah, and I think, you know, but it's probably not surprising if there's one thing that does seem to have really caught everyone's attention, it's this whole drive around addressing climate change. And I think it's an indirect measure of how we're going to change the industry, because, you know, the carbon proxy for how we have to change how we build and the operational performance of what we build, I wouldn't underestimate how important that's going to be in terms of even if we didn't want to change for all the other reasons I've outlined, that we're going to be forced to, because, you know, eventually through regulation, because even though government has started very lightly with things like the Future Home Standard, and it's now consulting on the Future Building Standard, this is going to get enshrined in law, and we've signed up to a 2050 net zero pledge. So the construction industry and the built environment industry on a broader basis has got to get their heads around this. So I'm not surprised by the recognition in that poll that this is a big issue.
Okay, thanks very much. Next question, and please, Abraham. Is your business moving towards greater use of MMC? Obviously, 30% think their businesses aren't moving towards this, but 70% think they are. So there's still a bit of a way to go here. What do you think, Mark?
Again, yeah, I'm happy with that, because actually, you know, this is all about not expecting absolutes here. This is about proportions of moving. Going back to my P&V analogy, really, you know, the idea of trying to take the industry on an incremental journey and not forcing it to change, you know, as a binary decision, is absolutely fair. And I think, you know, the fact that some parts of industry will not see a need or don't want to, or see a blocker to engage with MMC, is again a fair reflection of where we are at the moment. But the fact that 70% are moving towards it, not to say they might not still have issues at the moment around how they physically do that. I take a great positive from that, in terms of that, you know, there's that, again, it's back to that momentum of change that maybe perhaps is building out there at last. Great.
Okay, thanks very much. The next one, please. You made some comments on your own views on PMV. So 23%, not necessarily in agreement with PMV, which might be quite interesting to think about.
Yeah, so again, it's the same answer, Howard. I'm not expecting unanimity here. What's good to see is that there's a sense, there's a broad majority that perhaps understand what I'm trying to do with that measure, and move it away from being a binary. Let's do traditional or let's do something at the extreme end of MMC adoption. There's actually a huge choice in between, and it's not just about off-site manufacturing. There's a whole range of different techniques to increase your PMV, and to just use it as a more steady measure of how you incrementally change. So the fact that 77% of people seem to be recognizing that, I think is a real plus point. I'm very happy with that, and I encourage everyone, whether you're part of the 23% or the 77%, to have a play around with the PMV material that I showed in the hyperlink. I think that my presentation, I'm sure that could be shared after this, and you can go onto that link and have a play with it.
Thanks very much. Mark. What I would say is 60 represents only about 50% of the people who are here. So 50% didn't complete it. So maybe those who've got a stronger view did. So that's something to bear in mind. So thanks very much. Back to you, Andrew. Some good questions.
Thank you very much, Howard. And I think it's true to say, Howard and Mark, that if those same questions were asked 5 years ago, the percentage in the yes column would be significantly less than it is now. So I would say that's quite a massive step forward. While Abraham gets the questions ready, I just want to say hi to a few more people, to Paul Harris, to Rob Munns, Mike Lovegrove, Jim Roach, Saul Humphrey, Alan Yates, Abdullah Akpinar, Lisa Saunders and Marcus Saunders. So thank you all for joining in. We now have got the first question up, Mark. So there we go. Does the construction industry need an Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos to grasp the initiative, fund, disrupt, and create a paradigm shift in our inefficient industry? That's from Darren, as you can see. Interesting question to start us off.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I suppose the honest answer is, it's not going to do any harm, is it? Because you can see the impact that the likes of those people have had in their respective sectors. So, I suppose this is all a question of whether we want disruption to be positive or negative disruption. So, the idea of a big player coming in, or someone, with a dramatically different view on life coming in and upsetting the apple cart of how we do things. There's always a sort of a sense of, that would be an interesting thing to do to accelerate change and to force change in many respects. But we also, I think it's fair to say, for the existing incumbent players in the industry, that there's a desire that this is an orderly transition. And, if there is going to be external disruption from people that have got different views from, even the tech industry or manufacturing or retail or whatever it might be, that actually that can be inclusive and not destructive to the existing industry. We want the industry to prosper. We want everyone to go on that journey of, as I've said, increasing PMV, not actually, being put at risk because someone's come in with a wholly different idea. And I suppose, time will tell whether the likes of a Musk or a Bezos actually see fertile ground in construction and see that as an opportunity to come in and upset that apple cart. Hopefully, in the interim, the sort of more structured and orderly approach to modernisation can continue, and actually the industry as a whole can prosper.
I would suggest, Mark, that from a thinking point of view, you've actually been a disruptor yourself, because you've had such a massive impact on the way people are now thinking how to construct. So I congratulate you on that. Abraham, could we have the next question, please? Do you think the Draft Building Safety Act will have a positive or negative impact on the uptake of MMC in the construction industry? That's asked by John Griffiths.
Yeah, so if I'm brutally honest, I'm slightly disappointed by where the sort of post-Grenfell regulatory environment has moved to. I saw a big opportunity in actually signposting better the move towards manufacture and technology in a post-Grenfell world. So, everyone talks about the golden thread and the idea of better provenance of what we build and how we prove what we designed is what we end up building on site. And there's lots of talk about competencies, quite rightly. And I think, setting the bar and the CIC work and all of that is good stuff, and it's really important. And that in itself, for the reasons I've already highlighted in my report, is going to bring some real challenges to how we man up or we resource our industry in a way that can deliver different skills in different contexts. But there's a real lack of signposting for me of actually incentivizing a move towards more manufactured delivery and more technology-led delivery. There's not enough. It doesn't go far enough, in my view. And certainly, if I was to look at somewhere like New Zealand, where I have lots of contacts and I've been out there a couple of times, and they're just taking a change to their building regulations through the New Zealand Parliament, where they're positively incentivizing the move to MMC. They recognise that when it's done well and when it's properly accredited, actually it should be a proxy for less risk of something going wrong, and they're going to incentivize that by cutting down building control approval times. If you use more MMC and it's a pre-approved system, there's an accelerated approach to get through building control that they're pushing. They're doing that for a reason, which is they think it's a proxy for better quality when it's done well. So a bit of a missed opportunity for me.
Sorry, Mark. I think I'm right in saying that Dame Judith in her report also emphasised the need to consider systems, not building products in isolation, and acknowledge that actually it's quality, and the MMC actually goes hand in hand with improved quality. So I agree. I think some people are using the agenda maybe incorrectly for their own aims rather than looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah, but possibly. And I think, the idea, so I know Dame Judith has said outside of her reporting as well that she sees, there's an inevitability to us doing more in factory type environments where quality control can be executed better. But actually making its way into legislation is how you really drive that. And, there's probably a little bit lacking there.
Yeah. Okay. Next question, please, then, Abraham, if we could have, please. Do you think that accepting and dealing with past failures is an important first step in transforming the industry? That's come in anonymously.
Yeah, I think there's two things here. There's probably an element of not dwelling on the past. There's too many people, in my opinion, that actually are always talking about what's failed in the past. And actually, so much of what's going to happen in the future won't be informed by our past. But by the same token, I think it's absolutely fair to make sure we have learned where there's issues that are applicable still and are generic, to making sure we don't repeat the same mistakes again, particularly around industrialization, where there's clearly a lot of concern about where things have gone bad in the past. We should look back and just make sure that we're focused on making sure that this is different this time. I think the big thing that's going to make it different is technology. If we're doing this well and we're using technology in the right way, then it actually means that it's a different form of transformation to where we've attempted it in the past. So yeah, I think there's a balanced answer to that, in honesty.
Okay, could we have the next question, please, Abraham? How do we reconcile the fire concerns regarding timber and its environmental benefits? Another anonymous question.
Yeah, so I suppose I raised this myself in one of my slides when I talked about squaring the circle of fire safety and decarbonisation. So there is a tension at the moment. There's no two ways about it. And Andrew, I know you've been doing some work with STA to sort of get testing and the insurance industry more comfortable with how you actually can improve the performance of different timber systems in fire. And for me, it's a simple question about evidence and testing and proof and confidence building, and not being emotive about it, stripping it back to actually what is proven to work and what doesn't. And ultimately, we know timber has some significant benefits around its embodied carbon credentials and its sequestration characteristics. But we do have to make sure we retain public confidence. So it's a technical issue for me around material science, testing, and innovation.
You're absolutely right. It should be about evidence and science. And unfortunately, a lot of the comments that have been made up till now are what I would consider political or emotional. I understand that, but we need to come back with facts and evidence. The STA in the last couple of years has spent in the region of £350,000 on fire testing, with evidence to back that up. And we're undergoing a huge £500,000 testing program with CLT as we speak. So we're putting a lot of resource behind this question. But if we could have the next question, please. We only have about 5 minutes left. So John Griffiths asked, how do we look to aggregate demand for MMC in the private sector to promote investment in manufacturing capability in the UK?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So there's a sense here of how do you bring together the client community. The big challenge here is private sector clients operate independently by and large, and there's no sense of collaboration in terms of wanting to come together and join and aggregate as buying clusters, if you like. You see a bit of that in the public sector starting to happen now. You see frameworks and housing associations and local authorities moving on that journey to collaboration and aggregation. It is more difficult in the private sector because actually the drivers for collaborating are maybe less, and there's a bit of suspicion about, well, what's in it for me? Are we if we're competing, how can we share supply chains and how we can whilst we still compete? And there is we do need to address this, and I'm very much of the opinion that aggregation piece is critical to unlocking the MMC conundrum. We need to scale up, and we need to make up the demand on the MMC sector a bit more homogenous around asking for similar things rather than expecting everything to be a unique solution, because that doesn't help the sector grow. We're atomizing the sector more than anything. So I think that there's an element of just trying to get trust built in small clusters of client groupings, of similar peer group businesses, whether it's REITs, whether it's your Landsec's and your British Lands, whether it's your house builders, through in terms of the volume house builders working together. It's just about understanding and stripping back, well, what are the things that they all need that they could benefit from if they talk together and shared supply chains and pooled their demand, because ultimately that drives the economies that I was talking about around reducing unit production costs, which will benefit them all, and still enable them to go away and deliver individuality of the solutions and the architectural designs and everything that they want to create.
Mark, I think we've got time for one more question, if you could manage a quick answer. To what extent has the cladding debacle set back the wider adoption of MMC? Anonymous.
Yeah, so there's no doubt it has had an impact, a negative impact, because actually there's a conflation here between modern methods and the manufacturing process of putting something together in a structured, orderly way, and the materials being used. And this comes back to this point about there's a whole debate about the cladding issues are not about necessarily the manufacturing, it's about the materials that have been used and then the testing of those materials. And I sense that there is a sort of a broader conflation that hasn't helped the idea of complex buildings and building systems, when in reality it boils down to the use of certain materials in certain contexts that shouldn't have been allowed. And that is an issue which is not about MMC. That's an issue just about testing and product certification and building regulations, actually, if I'm honest. So there is a misconception issue, but unfortunately MMC has been caught up in it.
Yeah, so we're back to the perception, facts and evidence, aren't we? Mark, thank you very much. We've only got about a minute left. So I'm going to ask, first of all, Abraham, could you bring up we won't be able to get through the rest of the questions. Could you bring up the details, that's it, of My Pro Pass? So we've teamed up, ladies and gentlemen, with an organization called My Pro Pass, which will enable us now to give you the opportunity for a CPD certificate. It's a free certificate. You need to go to that www.mypropass.co.uk. And when you're asked, you need to put the event code in for today, CE-483, and you can download your own CPD certificate. So please, if you're interested, if you have a professional need for CPD, please do that. You've also got the facility with MyProPass to actually store all your other CPD material in one place. So it could be a useful tool for you. Now, I wonder, Abraham, if you could put the details up of the survey. We always like at the end of each event, not the questions, if we could have the survey. At the end of each event, we do ask you to just fill in with a survey just to tell us what you think. So once again, that's available at slido.com, LM090421. And if you would give us your feedback, it would be much appreciated. Before I do the final thanks, another couple of pieces of news. The Constructing Excellence Awards, or most of them, are open now. So if you've got any best practice projects or people or processes, please do go to your relevant CE regional website and download the booking and nomination forms, because we'd like to get as wide a portfolio of best practice examples for our 2021 awards. And the other piece of news, Mark, you might be interested to know, during your presentation, I had an invitation come through from the CLC to join the Construct Zero program board. So it looks like I we were working on that one. All it leaves me now to do, ladies and gents, is to thank Howard and Abraham, as always, for hosting today's Leaders Meets webinar, but most importantly, to thank Mark for giving of his time, of his knowledge, and also for being such an inspirational speaker. Mark, thank you so much. From all of us, a very good afternoon. I hope you have a pleasant weekend. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.